She had learned, long before she ever set foot inside the keep, that some beasts could not be healed, only survived. That was what her mother told her the morning they buried her father. And Marin had carried those words like a stone in her chest ever since, smooth and cold and certain. She was an Omega healer, the lowest of the low in the pack hierarchy, tolerated for her gift and ignored for everything else. She had no mate, no family left, no standing above the kitchen girls who at least had each other. What she had was her hands and the knowledge in them. And that had always been enough. Until the morning, the Alpha King's warhound bit through the wrist of the fourth healer, sent to treat it. And the castle ran out of people willing to try. The message came with blood still on the parchment, not real blood. Marin examined it carefully before she let herself worry. Just ink blotted and smeared by a hand that had written it in a hurry. The royal seal pressed into red wax at the bottom. The wolf's head with its crown of thorns. She recognized it. Everyone recognized it. The sigil of Aldrich the Unmerciful, Alpha King of the Northern Packs, Lord of 3 mountain territories and the frozen valley below them. A man whose coldness was spoken of the way people spoke of winter itself. Not as a character flaw, but as a fact of nature, unavoidable and absolute. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had heard them. He had taken the kingship at 19 after his father died in battle, had consolidated 3 warring packs into one through sheer force of will, a particular talent for making other alphas afraid of him. He never smiled at formal offenses. He had refused every mate candidate presented to him for 11 years. The Warhound. Kale, they called it. Though that name felt wrong to Marin the moment she read it, too ordinary for what the thing apparently was, had been his father's last gift. A creature bred from the old bloodlines, half wolf, and something else no one could name. It had lived beside Aldrich for 8 years. It had bitten every healer, every stable hand, every servant who came too close. It had never in 8 years bitten the king. That last detail was the one Marin kept returning to as she packed her kit in the cold gray hour before dawn. She wrapped her forceps and her suture thread, her poultices and her drawing salve, the small stoppered bottle of bone mend tincture she saved for emergencies. She tucked a sprig of dried fennel into her pocket because her mother had always said it kept the fear from becoming visible on your face. Then she stood in the center of her small room. The one she'd earned by being useful, barely larger than a closet, with a window that looked onto the stable yard. And she thought about the hound. Why would a beast that trusted no one trust the man who commanded it? That question lived inside her, the way important questions always did, taking up space, refusing to be ignored. In her experience, and she had 8 years of it by then, 8 years of tending wounds that other healers turned away from. 8 years of kneeling beside creatures and people who had every reason to bite. Distrust was not random. It had a source. It had a shape. A hound that bit every stranger, every woman, especially if the reports were accurate, was not a hound that had gone wrong. It was a hound that had been shown repeatedly that strangers were dangerous. That women specifically came near it to perform some kind of violation. Restaurants, she guessed. Examination, forced and frightening. 4 healers probably frightened themselves, bringing that fear in with them like a smell the animal could read before they even reached the door. She understood fear. She had been afraid every day of her life in one way or another. She had simply learned not to let it make her hands shake. The journey to the King's Keep took 3 hours by cart. The driver didn't speak to her. The guards at the outer gate looked through her, the way people looked through Omega healers, registering her presence as a function, not a person. She was shown to the keep's east wing by a junior steward who repeated twice that she was not to wander. not to speak to the king unless spoken to, and absolutely not to enter any room she hadn't been specifically directed toward. She listened and nodded and followed him through corridors of gray stone and torch smoke, and the faint, layered smell of a place that had been inhabited by the same family for a very long time. Wood smoke and tallow, and beneath that, something animal and warm. She smelled the hound before she saw it. That was important. Not a bad smell. She wanted to be clear about that to herself. Standing outside the heavy door the steward pointed at before retreating with obvious relief. It was not a smell of sickness or rot or infection, which she had half expected given the message's urgency. It was the smell of a large, healthy animal in distress. Stress had a particular scent, a sharpness under the normal musk, like iron under water. Whatever had hurt the hound, it was not its body. It was something else. She did not knock. She had learned early that knocking startled frightened animals, worse than a quiet entry. She opened the door slowly, fully, leaving it that way. She did not trap herself. She was not reckless, but she also did not create the impression of a closing space. And she stepped inside. The room was, by Keep's standards, and barely furnished. A pallet on the stone floor, heaped with rough blankets. A low table with a water bowl, and the untouched remains of what might have been the last 3 days' meals, dried to crusts. And in the far corner, where the shadows were deepest, the hound. She had expected something like a wolf, only larger. She was not prepared for what she saw. Kyle was the size of a draft horse's foal, gray-black with a coat that caught what little light there was and scattered it in unexpected directions, as though the animal's fur was made of something that light moved through differently than it should. Its eyes were amber, not the warm amber of autumn leaves, but the cold amber of deep water over stone, color without temperature. It was watching her. It had been watching her since she opened the door. It did not growl. That surprised her. She stopped in the center of the room. She did not move toward it. She set her kit down on the floor carefully, with deliberate slowness, and then she sat down too, cross-legged, on the cold stone, at what she judged was the midpoint between the door and the corner where the hound crouched. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. This was her method. This was, in fact, her only reliable method, and it had taken her years to trust it enough to stop second-guessing it. You did not go to a frightened creature. You made yourself available to it, unthreatening, patient, present. You waited until it decided whether you were safe enough to approach. You let it make the first choice. Control returned to it, and then the fear could begin to loosen. The hound watched her for a long time. She did not know how long. She had stopped wearing a timepiece because the keeping of time made her anxious in ways that patience couldn't fix. But she thought it was perhaps a quarter hour, perhaps more. The torch in the wall bracket burned lower. The cold pressed up through the stone floor and into her knees and her ankles, and she accepted that, stayed still, breathed evenly. Then the hound moved. It uncurled from the corner slowly, with a deliberateness that felt almost considered, and it covered the distance between them in a few unhurried steps that made no sound at all, which was remarkable given how large it was. It stopped, with its massive head perhaps 18 inches from Marin's face, and it breathed out through its nose a long exhale that she felt against her cheek like warm wind. She breathed back, slow and steady, and she looked at it without staring. At the thick jaw, the old scar that ran from its left ear to the corner of its mouth, the way it held one of its front legs slightly raised, not enough to be a limp, but enough. There it was, the source of the distress. Not emotional, after all, or not only emotional, something in that leg. An old injury, she thought. Something that had been healing wrong for a while, the way things healed wrong when they weren't tended properly. because the patient wouldn't allow anyone close enough to tend it. She did not reach for it, not yet. She let the hound make that decision too, and after another long pause, it lowered its enormous head and rested its chin on her knee. The weight of it made her breath catch, not from fear, from something else entirely. That particular feeling of being chosen, of a creature that trusted nothing, deciding to trust you. She had felt it before always with animals. Never quite so profoundly. She was so absorbed in the moment, in the slow, careful business of beginning to open her kit one item at a time, letting the hound smell each thing before she used it, that she did not hear the door behind her. She heard the stillness that came after it opened. She did not turn. She kept her attention on the hound, her hands moving with the same deliberate calm, and she said, quietly, without alarm, "Please don't come in yet. He's just beginning to trust the room." The silence from the doorway had a quality to it, a weight. She had grown up in a pack. She knew what alpha presence felt like when it pressed into a space, and this was not like anything she had felt before. It was not aggressive. She would have expected that, would have been prepared for the cold imperiousness of a king, interrupted and annoyed. This was something subtler and more complex, and it made the small hairs on the back of her neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She heard him stop. She heard, extraordinarily, the sound of a king doing what she asked. The hound did not look at the doorway. The hound was looking at her hands, watching her draw out the drawing salve, watching her uncork it with her teeth because she needed both hands for the next step. That was interesting. That meant the hound knew the king was there. Animals always knew and found it unremarkable, familiar, safe. She worked for perhaps 20 minutes before she understood what she was dealing with. It was a bone spur, she thought. An old fracture, improperly healed. The bone growing a small calcified extrusion that pressed painfully with certain kinds of movement. Not life-threatening, not even severe. But chronic pain changed behavior, changed temperament, made the patient irritable and protective of the sight of pain, and likely to strike out when anything came near it in a way that suggested it might worsen the hurt. The 4 healers hadn't been bitten because the hound was vicious. They'd been bitten because they'd gone straight for the leg. "He's been in pain for a while," she said, still without turning. "The front left leg. There's an old fracture that healed incorrectly. I can feel the calcification through the joint. It's not dangerous, but it's been hurting him every time he moves on it. Something changes a creature's whole character long enough in that kind of pain, makes them defensive of the thing that hurts." Another silence from the doorway, and then a voice. It was not what she expected, and she had tried to prepare herself for this too, because voices carried power, and alpha voices carried more of it than most, and she had wanted to be ready. But there was no being ready for Aldrich's voice. It was low and unhurried, and it had an edge to it that was not harshness, but something more like precision. "The way a blade was not cruel, but simply exact," he said. "3 healers told me there was nothing physically wrong with him." "They didn't get close enough to examine him," Marin said. Another pause. "He bit them." Yes. She was working now with both hands, pressing carefully around the joint, feeling the hound's muscles tighten, and then, slowly, release as she found the angle that was examination rather than aggravation. They came in afraid, and fear reads as threat to a frightened animal. He read them as threats. So he defended himself. That's not viciousness. That's sense. She heard him step into the room. He was being careful. She could tell from the sound of his footsteps, deliberate and measured. Nothing like the stride of a man claiming space. She thought, he does this every day. He comes into this room and he is careful, and the hound trusts him. And that tells her something that none of the stories had. "What can be done for him?" Aldrich asked. "The spur will need to be managed. There's a treatment." regular massage to keep the surrounding tissue from seizing, a poultice that will reduce the inflammation, and a limitation on certain kinds of movement for a few weeks while the tissue settles. It won't be cured. The bone has healed the way it's healed, and that's fixed now. But the pain can be reduced significantly. Managed. How often would treatment need to be applied? Daily, she said. And then, because she was honest by instinct and could not stop herself, by someone he allows to touch the leg, which, at the moment, appears to be me. She said it without any particular emphasis, as though it was simply an observation, a fact of the situation, not a bid for anything, not leverage. She had not come here for leverage. She heard something shift in the quality of the silence behind her. She turned then, finally, because she needed to look at him to understand what she'd heard in it, and because the hound's chin was still on her knee and the hound showed no sign of alarm. And so she turned. Aldrich stood perhaps 8 feet away. He was tall. She'd expected that. And broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested the breadth was real muscle rather than the padding some high-ranking alphas used to add to their silhouette. He was younger looking than she'd expected for a man who'd held a war-forged kingship for 11 years. Though there were lines at the corners of his eyes that weren't from smiling. His face was still. Not cold, she thought, adjusting the story she'd been carrying. Still. The way deep water was still. There was a great deal happening beneath it. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. And that was unusual, because reading expressions was one of the things she was best at. He said, "You're the Omega healer." "Yes," she said. "You sat on my floor." "I did." A beat. Something moved in his expression. Not quite the twitch of a smile, but adjacent to one. "He bit the last 4 people in this room." "I know," she said. "I didn't." He looked at her for a long moment. She held it. She had practice holding the gazes of people much more powerful than herself and not flinching. Because flinching accomplished nothing, and she watched him arrive at some kind of assessment. She didn't know what it was. She waited to find out. "You'll come back tomorrow," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said, "if that's what's needed." "It is." He paused. "I'll arrange a room." "That's not necessary," she said, and then immediately understood from the way his stillness took on a different quality. Not offended, but reconsidering that she had misread the nature of the offer. Not a courtesy, a practical decision. "Unless the treatment requires it," she amended. "It requires it," he said. "I won't have you traveling 3 hours each morning in winter to treat a dog." The word dog made the hound open one amber eye, as though registering the inaccuracy. The room she was given was not a closet. That was the first thing she noticed. The first thing that made her understand something about the king that the stories hadn't accounted for. It was a real room, not the guest rooms, not the fine chambers near the great hall where visiting alphas and dignitaries were housed, but a real room in the residential wing, with a window that looked south over the valley and a fire already laid in the grate, and a bed broad enough for 2. She stood in the center of it for a moment and felt, with a clarity she distrusted, that something was about to change. She told herself it was the change in circumstance. She had been taken out of her routine, installed in an unfamiliar place, given more comfort than she was accustomed to. It was disorientation, not premonition. She was not the kind of woman who believed in premonitions, despite being an Omega healer in a world that ran on pack magic. She believed in what she could examine with her hands and her eyes and the careful, methodical assessment of what was actually present. What was actually present when she examined it honestly. She had felt something when she turned and looked at Aldrich, something she had no name for, that lived in her chest rather than her head, that had the quality of a lock recognizing a key. She put that away. She was practical. She went to sleep. She treated Kale every morning for a week before Aldrich began staying in the room while she worked. The first 3 days he appeared only briefly, a figure in the doorway, checking, then gone. She had the sense that he was not checking on the Hound. She put that away too. On the 4th day he stayed. For the length of the treatment, standing in silence, watching her hands with an attention that she felt against her skin, like the faint pressure of sunlight. On the 5th day, he pulled a chair from the corner and sat in it. On the 6th day, he spoke. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. She was working the tissue around the bone spur, slow concentric circles with both thumbs, and the Hound was half asleep. A deep, rumbling exhalation of contentment moving through his massive body. "My mother," she said. "She was a healer too, and then 8 years of practice." "You're young for 8 years of practice." "I started young," she said. "We didn't have another healer in our village. My mother needed help." A pause. She could feel him assembling something, the way you felt the shape of a question before it was asked. He said, "Your pack, I don't have one, not anymore." She said it without particular pain. It was an old fact, one she had arranged herself around. "My father died when I was 12. My mother when I was 16. The pack absorbed me as a healer and kept me for that." "And the mate bond?" he asked. She looked up then, because the question was unexpected enough to warrant it. Alphas didn't ask Omegas about the mate bond. It was considered either irrelevant or indelicate, depending on the alpha's particular blend of indifference. He was watching her with that careful stillness, and she realized he had asked it with genuine curiosity, not cruelty. "I haven't found it," she said. "I'd given up assuming I would." He said nothing to that, but something moved in his expression that she would spend the next 3 days trying to identify. A coming back to it the way a tongue returned to a sore tooth. Recognition, she thought eventually. The specific expression of someone who had also given up on something and was looking at the evidence of their own giving up, reflected back from an unexpected direction. On the 7th day, Kale began to show something extraordinary. When she walked into the room in the morning, the Hound crossed to her before she even sat down, approached her immediately, without hesitation, and put his large head against her sternum with a force that would have knocked someone smaller off her feet. She steadied, wrapped her arms around his neck, and felt him lean into her with his full weight, which was considerable, and something about it broke her open in a way she hadn't expected. The giving of trust was always like this. It always cost her something even, as it gave her something back. Some exchange she couldn't account for rationally. She became aware that Aldrich was in the doorway, earlier than usual, watching. She said, without turning, "He's healing." She heard the roughness in her own voice and was briefly mortified by it. "The inflammation is down. The mobility is improving." "I know," Aldrich said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard there before. "I watched him walk to the water bowl last night, without favoring the leg." She straightened, finally turned. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his expression arranged in its customary stillness. But there was something around his eyes that was not still at all. She thought of the word she'd been avoiding all week and let herself think it, just once, quickly, and then put it away again, where it couldn't cause problems. She thought, warmth. She thought it and dismissed it, and her chest ached. On the 9th day, 2 things happened. The first was that she was summoned, with no warning and no explanation, to appear before the keep's council. She was told this by a senior steward who materialized outside the Hound's room while she was finishing the morning treatment. His expression careful in the way of a man delivering news he was not certain was good. The council was composed of 7 elders, 3 senior alphas, and the king's own beta, a lean, watchful man named Doran, who had the eyes of someone who cataloged everything and shared very little. They were assembled in the formal receiving hall when Marin was brought in, and she saw immediately, with the pattern recognition she had developed over years of being the smallest person in any given room, that she had been summoned to be evaluated. She was an unknown quantity who had moved into the king's residential wing. She had gained unusual access to the king's animal, and through it to the king himself. She was an Omega with no pack affiliation and no political accountability, and that made her a risk they had not calculated for. She stood before them and answered their questions with the same honesty she brought to everything. Yes, she was Omega rank. No, she had no pack affiliations. Yes, she had stayed in the keep at the king's invitation. Yes, she had daily access to his private quarters by extension, through the Hound's room, which connected through a hall to the king's own suite. She watched their faces as they absorbed this, and knew, with a certainty that was depressing in its familiarity, what they were thinking. They were thinking she was a threat or a tool, the same calculation they made with every Omega who got too close to something valuable. Was she a danger, or could she be used to neutralize one? She said, before they could arrive at their conclusion and speak it aloud. I understand the concern. I'm a stranger with access I wasn't expected to earn. If it would settle the council, I'm willing to treat the Hound from the village. I can make the journey each morning. Doran, the beta, said, That won't be necessary. He said it quickly, and she heard something in the quickness that was interesting. The king had already spoken on this. The council had been given instructions, not to rearrange Marin's situation, but to assess her, to decide what she was. She was being looked at the way a new element in an existing system was always looked at, for disruption potential. What the council wants to understand, said the eldest of the three senior alphas, a man with white temples and the kind of authority that came from knowing where everything was buried, is the nature of your interest in the king. She held his gaze. I have no interest in the king, she said. It was true in every way that mattered, and she said it without flinching. And if some part of her felt the lie in the word interest, the insufficient smallness of it, the way it failed to account for that lock and key feeling she kept putting away, she gave none of that away. She was good at this. She had been practicing this particular concealment her whole life. I was sent for to treat a sick animal. That's what I'm doing. They dismissed her, eventually, with nothing resolved and nothing offered, and she walked back through the stone corridors. And she felt, with a clarity that frightened her, that she had just been weighed against a standard she didn't fully understand, and that the outcome of the weighing would matter. She was so absorbed in this that she turned a corner and walked directly into Aldrich. It was the first time she'd been physically close to him, within reach, close enough to smell him. And the effect was immediate and involuntary and completely devastating. She stepped back quickly, but not before the smell reached her. Warm stone and pine resin, and something underneath both that was purely, specifically him. The signature of a person that could not be described, only experienced. And what she experienced was a recognition so total that her vision went briefly white at the edges, and she had to put her hand against the wall to keep her balance. She did not fall. She was not a woman who fell, but it was very close. He caught her elbow. His hand was warm through the fabric of her sleeve, his grip careful rather than hard. And he said her name, which was the first time he'd used it, Marin. Low, immediate, not alarmed but alert, the voice of a man who noticed things the moment they changed. She straightened. She removed her elbow from his grip, gently but firmly, because she needed the distance, needed the air between them. She said, I'm fine, I apologize. I wasn't looking. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before and didn't know how to read. She was good at reading expressions. She could not read this one. "The council," he said. "I appeared as requested," she said. "I know." He paused. "I didn't ask them to summon you. Someone did." Another pause, longer. She watched him arrange something behind those careful eyes, saw him make a decision. "Doran manages risk," he said finally. "He decided you were one. Am I?" She had not meant to ask it. It came out before she could redirect it. Honest in the way things were honest when she was off balance. She watched him hear it. Watched him understand that she was asking something larger than the surface question. And she watched him choose how to answer it. "I don't know yet," he said. It was the most honest thing he could have said. And it was the thing that broke through the careful distance she'd been maintaining. Not dramatically. Not with any visible effect. But below the surface, where the lock had been sitting, waiting for the key to come back around. She did not sleep well that night. The following days arranged themselves around a new architecture that she hadn't designed and didn't know how to dismantle. Aldrich began to bring his work to the Hound's room in the afternoons, sitting in the corner chair with correspondence and reports, while she completed the second treatment of the day. She did not acknowledge this directly, and neither did he. But the silence they shared was not empty silence. It was the particular kind of silence that happened between people with a great deal to say and insufficient certainty about whether it was safe to say it. He asked her questions sometimes, small questions, the kind that built up to something larger slowly. The way rivers built their banks. He asked what she thought about Omega rank in the pack system. Not the politics of it, but whether she thought it was accurate, whether the ranking matched anything real. She told him what she actually thought, which was that power hierarchies rarely matched reality, but were useful fictions maintained by the people they benefited. She waited for him to be offended, because kings were generally interested in being agreed with. He was not offended. He said yes, just that, and went back to his correspondence. She asked him census, emboldened by several weeks of this particular intimacy, the intimacy of shared space and honesty, why he had never accepted a mate bond. She asked carefully, aware that she was stepping into territory that was not technically hers to enter. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Every candidate was chosen by someone else, presented to me as appropriate, as politically useful, as whatever the council decided I needed. And I watched them come in afraid of me. Every one of them afraid, performing willingness because they'd been told to." He paused. "I've spent my life surrounded by people who are afraid of me. I didn't want a mate who was one of them." She thought about this. She said, "I'm not afraid of you." It was true. She was afraid of other things, important things, the feeling in her chest every time he said her name, but not of him. She heard him stop moving on the other side of the room, heard the particular stillness. That was his version of an emotional reaction. He said, "I know." Those two words changed the temperature of everything, though she could not have said precisely how. Doran came to her room that night. She opened the door and saw his careful eyes and knew this was not a social call. She let him in because she had nothing to hide. Believed it firmly, and he stood in the center of her room and said, "You understand what's happening." "I understand I'm treating a hound," she said. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "You're perceptive. I've been watching you. Don't perform ignorance at me. You understand what's happening." She held his gaze for a moment and then let it go, because he was right and she was tired of the performance. "I understand what might be happening," she said. "I haven't allowed myself to think further than that." "The king," Doran said, "has not brought someone into the residential wing since he took the throne. He has not sat in the same room with anyone for a cumulative 12 hours in the same period. He has not asked the kitchen to provide for a guest's meal preferences since." He stopped. "Since never, actually. That's new." She sat down on the edge of the bed because she needed to, because her legs were unreliable all of a sudden. What are you trying to tell me? Doran sat too, which surprised her, perched on the chair by the fire, his elbows on his knees, the careful eyes softer than she'd seen them. He said, I came to his father's keep when I was 19 and Aldrich was 14. I've watched him build himself into what he is. I know what he looks like when he's protecting himself from something. And I know what he looks like when something has gotten through the protection. He paused. I've been managing risk for 11 years. I misjudged the nature of yours. She looked at him. You're not a threat, he said. You're the opposite. And I should have seen that earlier. And I'm telling you now because I think you need someone to say it plainly. Whatever you're feeling, it's real and it's reciprocal. And if you're waiting for evidence that you're wrong about it, you won't find it. She was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the valley was dark and the wind was moving through the pine trees with a sound like breathing. I'm an Omega, she said, with no pack, no rank, no political standing. He is an Alpha King. Yes, Doran said. The council will. The council, Doran said, answers to the king, not the other way around. She looked at him. He looked back. Something passed between them that was not quite hope. Hope was too fragile a word for what Marin allowed herself to carry. But was the shape of it, the structural form. She did not sleep at all that night. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of a woman. She was announced at the gates 2 mornings later. Lady Sarah of the Western Pack, an alpha blood female with the reputation that preceded her by some hours via the kind of whisper transmission that kept large households functioning. She was beautiful. Marin was told by the kitchen girl who brought her morning tea with an expression of transparent sympathy. She was politically valuable. She had been put forward by 3 of the 7 council members as a candidate for the king's mate bond. She had arrived without invitation, but with the particular confidence of someone who expected that the invitation was merely a formality. Marin heard all of this and felt a sensation in her chest that she identified, unhappily, as the thing she had been trying not to feel since the first morning she'd looked at Aldrich and felt the lock turn. She had not named it yet. She was afraid that naming it would make it impossible to survive losing it. She went to treat Kael that morning as she always did, and Kael was fine, improving daily now, the inflammation down to almost nothing, the mobility nearly fully restored, and she worked with her hands and her concentration, while the rest of her was somewhere else entirely, turning over every word, every silence, every careful piece of proximity for evidence of what she feared and what she hoped. Simultaneously, like a woman who couldn't decide whether she wanted to find the thing she was looking for. She was packing her kit when she heard voices in the corridor, multiple voices. The bright, forward-projected voice of a woman accustomed to being listened to, and beneath it, quieter and giving nothing away, Aldrich. She could not make out words, but she could make out the shape of the exchange, the push and the stillness, the way his silence had the quality of a wall. Then the door opened. Lady Sarah was everything the kitchen girl had said. She was tall, dark-haired, dressed in traveling clothes that somehow managed to be elegant, with an assurance about her that Marin recognized as genuine rather than performed. She was not pretending to belong in doorways. She belonged in them. She swept her gaze around the room and found Marin kneeling on the floor with her kit, and her hands still damp from the salve. And her expression arranged itself into something politely inquiring. "This is your healer?" she said, to Aldrich, who had come in behind her. "This is Marin," Aldrich said. "The Omega one," Sarah said. There was nothing overtly cruel in the way she said it. It was simple categorization, the unconscious hierarchy of someone who had never had reason to question the way the ranks worked. I'd heard the Hound had taken to her. He has, Aldrich said. Sarah looked at Kale, who had retreated to the far corner of the room at her entrance and was watching her with both amber eyes, and his weight shifted to his haunches. Reading threat again. Marin noted this with the professional part of her mind, and the rest of her was focused on breathing evenly. I'd like to try, Sarah said. She said it easily without understanding what she was asking. She took a step toward the hound. Kale's ears went back. He's not. Marin started. He'll be fine, Sarah said, pleasantly. The pleasantness of someone who found it charming that the Omega healer had an opinion. I'm excellent with animals. She took another step. Kale's lips pulled back, and the sound that came from him was not a growl. It was lower than that, more fundamental. The vibration of an animal communicating something in a frequency beneath human argument. Stop, Marin said. She was on her feet. She said it without particular forcefulness. She never used forcefulness. It didn't work. But she said it clearly, and she stepped between Sarah and the hound without calculating whether that was tactically wise. Because the only calculation that mattered was that Kyle was about to bite someone and she could stop it. Sarah stopped. The hound sound shifted, recognition moving through it, settling. He came to Marin's side, and she put her hand on his neck without looking away from Sarah. There was a silence that had several layers to it. The top layer was ordinary social discomfort. Below that, something else. Something that lived in the particular quality of Aldrich's attention, which she felt against the side of her face, though she was not looking at him. He doesn't trust strangers, Marin said, to Sarah, calmly. It's not personal. He doesn't trust anyone who hasn't given him time to learn them. Sarah looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Aldrich. Something passed between them. Marin didn't watch it. She was watching Kale, but she felt it. And Sarah said, I see, in a voice that understood something now that it hadn't before. She looked back at Marin. The polite pleasantness had rearranged itself into something more complex, and Marin thought, more honest. You stepped between him and me. Yes, Marin said, without thinking about it. There wasn't time to think, Marin said. He was going to bite you. You didn't consider whether it would be politically wise, Sarah said. Marin looked at her then, directly. No, she said, I didn't. Sarah looked at her for another moment. Then she looked at the king, and her expression completed some calculation that Marin could not fully follow, and she said, I see, again, but differently this time, with a finality that had nothing to do with the hound. She left. Not immediately. There was the remainder of the morning, a formal luncheon that Marin was not invited to and did not want to attend. The visible political theater of a visit that both parties understood was not going to result in the thing it had been intended to result in. Marin spent that time in the hound's room with Kale, her back against the wall, his great head in her lap, and she sat with what she knew and what she was afraid to claim, and the space between the two, which was, she decided, no longer tolerable. It was not tolerable because Doran had told her it was real and reciprocal. It was not tolerable because she had stepped between a high-ranking alpha blood woman and a threat without thinking, which meant her instincts had already organized themselves around this place, this animal, this man, in a way that her rational mind was still arguing with. And it was not tolerable because there was a word for the lock and key feeling that she had been putting away for 6 weeks, and the word was mate. And she was done not saying it, at least to herself, in the privacy of the room with the healing hound in her lap. She said it once, quietly, to the top of Kale's head. She thought Kale already knew. That evening, Aldrich came to the hound's room alone, not at the hour of the treatment. The treatment had been completed in the afternoon. Marin had been preparing to return to her room for the night. But in the hour after the evening meal, the quiet hour when the keep settled into its night rhythms, and the torches in the corridors were turned low. He came in without ceremony, and he sat in the corner chair, and she understood, looking at him in the low light, that something had shifted in the architecture of his stillness. Lady Sarah has declined to extend her visit, he said. I know, Marin said. She had heard this through Doran, who had materialized with the information and a cup of tea, and the expression of a man refraining from saying, "Told you so," she said. He stopped. She said she recognized when a space had already been claimed. Marin was quiet. Her hands were still in her lap, and she kept them that way. Kept herself very still. Because she could feel what was coming in the air the way she felt weather changes. A pressure drop. A shift. The council met this afternoon, Aldrich said. I'm sure you'll hear about it tomorrow. They've decided the most efficient course of action is to send you back to your village. Her breath stopped. They believe, he continued, that you've become a distraction, that your continued presence in the residential wing creates an ambiguity in the king's situation that discourages appropriate candidates from presenting themselves. He paused. They presented this as a decision that had been made. She said carefully, "And has it been?" He looked at her for a long moment. In the low light, his eyes were very dark, the careful stillness fully present. And she looked back at him the way she had been looking at him for 6 weeks. Directly, without flinching, without performing anything at all. She was not afraid of him. She had never been afraid of him. She admitted to herself in this moment, profoundly, comprehensively terrified of this, of the thing between them that had been building itself out of daily proximity and shared silence and the particular quality of a lock turning, because she had been unworthy of things all her life, and she had learned to hold them loosely, so the taking away wouldn't shatter her. They presented it as a decision, he said. And I told them that decisions about who stays in my keep are mine, not theirs. His voice was level. Certain. I told them that the question of who I recognize as my mate is also mine. Not a committee, not a candidate list, not 11 years of waiting for a woman who comes in afraid. He paused. I told them I had already found the answer to the question, and it wasn't their business to unfind it for me. The silence was total. Cale breathed beside her. The fire popped and settled. Marin, he said, and then in the voice she had been hearing in her chest since the first morning she turned and looked at him. I am not asking for your compliance. I am not offering you a position or a political arrangement or any of the things the council would like me to offer. I am telling you that you walked into a room where 4 healers before you had bled, and you sat down on the floor and waited, and in 6 weeks you healed what 8 years hadn't touched, and you stepped in front of a high-ranking woman to protect a dog. He's not a dog, Marin said, automatic. Something happened on his face. It was not quite a smile, not the public performance of a smile, not anything calculated. It was smaller and more real than that. The involuntary movement of something that had been held still for a long time releasing. He said, "No, he's not." And then, "How could I not love every unreasonable, fearless, particular thing about you?" And there it was, the question she hadn't known she'd been waiting for, the one that had no argument in it, that was not seeking permission or approval, but simply declaring a fact with the precision of a man who did not say things he didn't mean. She was on her feet before she'd decided to be. She crossed the room in 3 steps, and she stopped in front of him. Close, within reach. Close enough to smell that particular warmth that had knocked her sideways the first times. And she looked at him. "I'm an Omega," she said, "with no pack and no rank and no political value." "I know," he said. "The council." "The council," he said, "will accommodate themselves to reality. That's what councils do." She looked at him for another moment, and then she said the true thing. The thing she had been putting away. The thing that was ready to be said. Since the first time I turned around and looked at you, she said. I have felt. She stopped. Started again. There is a word for it. I know what the word is. I've been afraid to use it because I don't hold things I might lose. Then don't lose it, he said. She looked at him. He looked back, and in the space between one breath and the next, she felt the mate bond fully. Not as a new thing, but as the recognition of something that had been building for six weeks. The lock entirely open now. No more managing it. No more folding it away. She felt it settle into her chest like warmth, like something returning to where it had always been meant to be. She reached out and put her hand against the side of his face, her healer's hands calloused and careful and very certain. He was warm. Of course he was warm. He had always been warm. The stories had gotten that entirely wrong, or perhaps they'd only ever seen the outside, the weather, the winter fact of him, and never what was underneath it. He turned his face into her hand the way KL had turned into her hands on the first morning. That same quality of a creature giving trust to the person who had been patient enough to earn it. And something behind his eyes came fully present. She was not particularly tall. He had to come down to her, and he did. And when his mouth found hers, the mate bond completed itself. Not explosively, not like the stories said, full of lightning and the howl of wolves at midnight. But the way a breath completed itself at the end of the exhale, the way a bone set properly completed itself in the body that had been compensating for its wrongness, naturally and irrevocably, and with a sense of rightness, so absolute it was almost quiet. Kale made a sound from the floor beside them, a deep, satisfied sound. He had been waiting for this, Marin thought. In the distant part of her mind, still capable of thought. He had known since the first morning. That was why he had crossed the room and put his enormous head against her chest. He had been trying to tell them both, in the only language he had, that this was correct, that this was the thing that was supposed to happen. They stayed in the room through the full dark hours, Marin and the king and the hound, and they talked with the ease of people who have already done most of the important talking in silence. She learned that he had been 14 when his father first showed him Kale as a pup, and that the bond between them was not the formal bond of a king and his war animal, but something older and more mutual, something that had kept him company through 11 years of chosen isolation. She told him about her father's death and the pack that had kept her as a function rather than a person, and the way she had organized her life around the idea of being useful, because being useful was safer than being loved. She said that last part quietly, as though it might not be quite true if she said it too softly. He said, "You're done with that." He said it with the same precision he brought to everything. Not a command, not a comfort, but a statement of fact about a reality that had changed. She believed him. In the morning, before the council could convene, or the steward could arrive with carefully worded documents, or Lady Sarah, Seth, could send a polite letter of congratulation. That was actually a political calculation. Aldrich took Marin to the great hall, not for any ceremony. There would be time for ceremony. It would be done correctly and publicly, and with the full weight of the king's authority behind it. But first this, just this. He walked into the great hall, where the morning staff were laying the tables for breakfast, and where Doran stood at the far end with his cataloging eyes, and he stood with Marin beside him, her hand in his, and he said to the room in the voice that had always been exact and precise, and without any need for volume, because it was simply itself certain and final. She is my mate, my Omega. Any question about her rank, her standing, her right to this keep, and everything in it comes to me. The room was quiet. Then Doran, from his position at the far end of the hall, made the smallest sound. Not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh, but the expulsion of something that had been held for a very long time by a man who had been hoping for exactly this and managing his hope carefully. Marin stood in the great hall of an alpha king with her healer's hands and her careful eyes, and her complete absence of fear and the mate bond warm in her chest like a hearth that had finally been lit. And Kale pressed against her left leg, a solid and unhurried weight, and she felt the truth of something she had almost missed. The thing she had thought made her unworthy was the thing that had made her irreplaceable. Not her rank, not her bloodline, not any of the currencies the hierarchy traded in. The willingness to sit down on a cold floor and wait, to offer presents without demand, to walk into a room where everyone before her had bled and not flinch. That was the thing that could not be selected for by a council, or arranged by political convenience, or found anywhere except in a woman who had spent her whole life being essential to people who hadn't known how to value her. She had been worth something all along. She had simply been waiting for someone who could see it. Kale leaned harder against her leg, and she reached down and rested her palm on the top of his great head, and the low morning light came through the high windows of the hall in long pale shafts, and Aldrich's hand was warm around hers, and she thought of her mother's words. Some beasts could not be healed, only survived, and understood at last that her mother had been wrong, or perhaps had only known a different kind of healer than the one her daughter had become. Because some beasts could be healed, were healed, by exactly the right hands, and the healing went in both directions. And this was how it felt when you stopped surviving and began, finally and without apology, to belong somewhere.